Hi there, my name's Ben Lee. I'm the art director on Void Bastards, made by Blue Manchu. Today we're going to be talking about the origin stories of Void Bastards, which is to say, I'm going to try and give you some insight into what happened before we made the game, in pre-production, and how things changed while we were making the game. So the first thing we've got is a 3-page comic I did early in production. It wasn't the first thing we did, but it was done quite early in production to help everyone in our team, which is distributed, or certainly was distributed for most of production. I was in the UK. A lot of the team was in Canberra, but we also had team members in Canada and Scotland. So we were sort of all over the place. So in order to communicate to everybody the general look and feel of the game, I find this sort of brief comic book is very useful. It's a bit more narrative than just a bunch of dry stills. But in this case, it was very important because we decided early on that we wanted to pursue a comic book aesthetic. And I'm not someone who really likes half measures. So when we went for the comic book aesthetic, we all bought into the idea of we were going to try and make every part of this game look like a comic book, not just a theme or a front end or a combat section. Everything was going to look like it was taking place in the pages of a comic book. How successful that was is up to you as an audience, but I was doing my best to try and make everything as comic book like as possible. So you can see in these pages that the original idea, for the narrative side at least, because the gameplay didn't really change very much from what we intended from day one. However, the world and the feel of Void Bastards actually changed quite radically. So in these pages, you can see that the initial player character wasn't a series of prisoners. It was a single person. And the idea was that this person, when they died, would actually die, but would be replicated back on what has become the Steve in Void Bastards, but we called it the Pod at the time. And every time this person was reincarnated, they would pick up photocopier style errors. So a gauge of how successful you'd been at the end of the game was how genetically messed up this character had become over, in between 0 and hundreds of times of being resurrected. So you can see in these pages that it was a little more hard science fiction, a little more near future astronaut than what we ended up with in Void Bastards. And that was something that only really changed, I would say, about the midpoint of the project. I've talked about this in other interviews, which was when we brought Cara Ellison on, very talented writer, and we all committed to the idea of trying to make it into a black comedy, as opposed to what was done in these pages, which is was just a really, really desperate, sad tale of someone who was alone in space. Okay, what we've got here is a very early mock-up of how we might try and do a cutscene in a comic book form, and this is the one that would sort of set up and open the game that Cara and I worked on together. We did decide at the end that it was far too long, and consequently, we reapproached how we did these, and we made them much more brief and sort of much more to the point. But I think this is a fascinating thing to look at, especially if you're a fan. Like, I've actually really enjoyed looking at all this stuff myself this week, and you can see just how different even the tone was. It's got elements of Cara's jokes and the Douglas Adams influence and everything else, but it isn't quite the same as what we wound up with. So to just finish off the topic of the comic book look I was talking about, how everything needed to be a comic, these are early concepts of how the campaign map, the loadout screen, and the machine map might look. We didn't know at this point. This was all just done in Photoshop. We didn't have anything really working in the game at this time. And I think you can see here that I was really pushing maybe beyond what was reasonable for how the interface would look like comic book panels. I wanted to have panels themselves be sort of part interface and part storytelling, so it was all mixed together. And that never really works very well. It's always confusing for people. So, like a lot of things, I was trying to start out pushing as hard as I could to get it as comic booky as possible, and then gradually make concessions to useful user interface. So I really actually kind of miss some of these little touches where there was a character's inner monologue mixed in amongst the UI elements to kind of guide you through it. But I find it really interesting to look back at these with some fondness. And it's interesting that the colors were very different in these as well. We hadn't come up with the idea of orgs yet, the organizations which are on the different spaceships. So all of the wild colors that you see in the different ships, I was just using all at once rather than trying to match them to particular things. So the next thing I would like to talk about is the way we develop the environments, which were very, very important, obviously, in the sort of game that Void Bastards is. We needed to make a lot of levels, but we needed to keep the scope very manageable, much as everything else in the game. Now, this is an area we couldn't economize quite as much as in other places where, for example, the cutscenes, we decided to do them as largely still comic book images because it would fit with the theme, but also wouldn't require a lot of animation. With environments, we couldn't really do that. So we had to come up with a way to make the task manageable. And from my point of view, it fell to me to design an art style which didn't include tons and tons of detail that would be expensive or time consuming, which are the same thing, to create. So early on, we decided on a very open, thin line look. I found the easiest way for me to pre-visualize this stuff was actually to use SketchUp, which is what you're seeing right now. And this had the advantage of being able to do little walkthrough animations for team members who weren't in the room with me that I could post and they could look at when they woke up in their time zone. And I found it very useful to be able to virtually walk around inside a space when it was still being concepted before anyone had attempted to 3D model it. This is actually the first test that I could find that we did when we were still trying to decide whether or not we could make a 3D environment game with sprites, in the old school manner of Outlaws and Duke Nukem that I'm very fond of. Concept being, though, that we could do that with high-resolution textures that would look more like illustrations and less like pixelated 90s video games. And it was this clip that gave us the confidence to move forward. It's interesting to me here that you can see that the technology level and the look and feel was very different to what we wound up with in Void Bastards. We've got a very clean-looking, futuristic handgun. The enemies are very contemporary-looking. The next step was to take this rough model and to do some paint-over mock-ups of how the game might look when you were really playing it. Now, these images are really interesting to me because it takes me back to when we hadn't really established a unique, what I would call a unique look for Void Bastards. A lot of this really does look like animation, it is my background before getting into games. And it's sort of funny to see how quickly I fall back to that when I'm pushed into a corner. So I liked all of this stuff and we thought it looked cool, but our main concern was that it didn't look particularly unique. At best, it would look like good animation, and at worst, it would just look like, bad animation. You can see here too, the enemy design was really nothing like what we ended up with. But at this stage in the project, I was kind of just stabbing in the dark at what possibilities could we have. And stay tuned later on for the development of the monsters, which is in itself a topic. Okay, here is probably the first proper mock-up that I did when we decided to move forward with this idea. And at this stage, I was still kind of drawing this stuff like anime and not really like a comic book, or at least it felt that way. I was trying to make it look like a comic book, but it kept coming out like anime. And the biggest difference here really is that you can see that the enemies are alien creatures. They're not mutated citizens like we wound up with in the full game. And none of us were really that happy with them. We knew that we needed some enemies that I could animate reasonably easily. All of the enemies we already knew were going to be hand animated by myself, which limited the amount of detail I could really put into them. So we were going for very organic, squashy looking monsters. The problem with that was they didn't particularly have a lot of character, and that was something that we couldn't really get past. And the solution to that will be coming up later in the talk. So now we've got a video of the first real 3D in-engine mock-up that we did to kind of test these ideas out further and make sure we were heading in the right direction. And you can see in this that there's a lot more traditional, like sort of Jack Kirby influence in the way we rendered space. The monsters are very serious. It was still in that kind of System Shock 2 horror sci-fi region. And while it's fun for me to look at this, it's interesting as well because we really hadn't figured out really what the direction was for the game yet. We were really just working through ideas. Although a lot of these did survive. We didn't throw everything out at every stage. That's not really the way we work. But yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff here that really isn't in the final game, and especially the color and lighting is nothing like what we ended up with. So one of our takeaways from these experiments was that the ships that we'd made and the art that we'd done, it didn't really look like derelict spaceships. They looked like functioning spaceships. And that didn't really fit with the gameplay we were looking for, which was very much supposed to feel like scavenging. So here are concepts of the more derelict, beat up, already looted shipwrecks that the player would be looting and raiding throughout the course of the game. And lastly, here's some concepts of the door switches, which we revised many, many, many times and had dozens of discussions about. It's funny to see this now, considering how much time we did spend on tweaking the way doors worked and which side of the door the handle was and whether or not it had a handle and a million other things. But let's move on to something more interesting. So we approached the spaceships in Void Bastards, of which the game is primarily composed of, from the inside out. So after spending a lot of time trying to design and explore the sorts of layouts that would be fun for the player, we made the deliberate decision to do that before we bothered worrying about what they looked like on the outside. So once we'd gone through that process, I started trying to design sort of exterior skins to these modular Lego-like constructions that we were going to do. Very early on, we considered procedurally generating the ships, and sometimes people report the ships as being procedurally generated, but they aren't. They're all hand-designed so that they feel like a spaceship with procedural elements inside them, like doors that may or may not be broken, or at least have furniture that is there sometimes and other times not. But the ship's always the same actual layout. They're all designed by Jay. And this early on, though, we weren't sure if we were going to do that. So the exteriors were also designed to be modular. So it was possible that we could build these ships out of pieces that just locked together, and different combinations would be different sorts of ship. This wasn't something that ended up happening, but it drove a lot of the early design. And it's interesting to look at these because they don't really look anything like the ships that you might see on the star map now in Void Bastards, which wound up just being hand-drawn to look distinct from one another as the most important aspect of the design, not so much how well they mirrored what the actual layout was. And in this final image, you can see I was still clinging to this idea of a sea ship with exposed ribs and dangling guts. And I was trying to reintroduce that into these very dry CGI-based models that I'd been doing. Once again, did all these in SketchUp, primarily because it was just the fastest way for me to get this stuff done. So I've managed to dig up some really old concepts from very early of what the player character and also what the crew of the ships might look like. In fact, I think at this point, we hadn't even decided that the enemies wouldn't be human. There was a possibility they might just be people or they might be robots. And you can see in all of these designs, there's a strong, it's a much more of a near future International Space Station look that we were going for. And it was actually, I found that quite difficult to do in a comic book style because it was very dry. But I persevered with it, and you can see we got some interesting, kind of more familiar Hollywood designs, I guess I'd say. which, as you can see, really didn't make it into the final game at all, where we decided to push much harder on improvised, handmade, bodged together weapons rather than slick things that you'd find down the ship that someone else had designed perfectly. Here's a fun one. This is the original handgun that we designed. It actually had full animations for reloads and for firing, and it looked cool, but it also took so long that we decided to use physical animation spring systems for a lot of those things rather than hand animate every frame of each gun being reloaded or firing. But this is the instructions for our first stab at that. So these pictures are, a lot of these actually made it more or less intact into the game. These were done a lot later, but they were when we decided what we were doing, and I was just forging ahead with trying to get interesting looking handmade weapons or hand modified weapons that look different to each other. And it's kind of cool to see some of them almost didn't change at all. Some of them are no longer in the game, like the bomb, which was a thing that you threw into a room and made all the monsters run out before it exploded, which was just nowhere near as much fun as the cluster flak, which is my second favorite name that I came up with for a thing in a video game ever. So these are really old. This is like really early high concept. What possible monsters could we have in this spooky haunted spaceship graveyard, which we stuck with all the way through the game. These really, we decided they were too much like a horror game, and that wasn't really what we were going for. I think I still had a lot of System Shock 2 rattling around in my head, which is the sort of game we were trying to make, but we weren't trying to remake it. We were trying to do our own thing, and a big part of that is having your own visual distinctive style. So here's some ideas for aliens. The reason they're sort of chitinous is because I still wanted to sort of push this Sargasso Nebula deep sea but in space feel, which we really moved away from completely. But that's where the barnacle-faced man or the biomimic and all the tentacly stuff and the carapaces came from in these pictures. But I don't think much of this really survived at all into the full version of the game. So staying in the deep sea vein, this was an idea where all of the enemies were a form of space jellyfish and that took over host human beings and gradually morphed them into something else. I quite like these, but by the same token, they were kind of just squidgy monsters, and we knew we hadn't really quite got there yet with them. These guys are an example of me deciding that I was on the wrong track, so I'd throw a very, very hard left turn. And tried to do a bunch of 1950s sort of rubber suit enemies that you might find in an old low-budget movie, and try and use interchangeable parts to sort of extend the variety. And by the same token, maybe some really throwback-looking, although it actually doesn't look that spaceship looks more like a Void Bastard spaceship than anything else we've seen in this video already, but I guess that's what comes out when I try and do that. Here's a suite of aliens that I designed, pretty much none of which made it into the game in any form. I don't think they got any further than this drawing. The soldier grub we did make a model of, but I don't think it had all of its full suite of animations. I think it just sort of stood there. The idea here was the enemies were some sort of technological race that utilized bioengineering and had advanced, rubbery technology. The gun was kind of cool, but we used nothing else from this. So this is a test frame from the first time I animated a monster to try out in the game. And you might remember it from one of the early bridge concepts earlier in this video. It was designed to be animatable and to be stretchy and be able to change shape and to sort of take advantage of the medium. But for me, once I'd finished doing it, I really didn't like it anymore. It had lost its feeling of elasticity, and it was very difficult for me to animate this well, because although it's supposed to be simple, it's actually quite complicated. It has far too many lines in it, which is a real problem when you have to draw lots and lots and lots of frames. So here you begin to see the first inklings of what would become the Void Bastard citizens, which is human crew members who've been warped by the Sargasso Nebula into horrible abominations. The brain-headed guy actually was in the game for quite a long time. He would become the sniper, which is the sort of upside-down backwards person that we have in the game now. This big guy was the original ogre. I don't really know what Tentacle Guy was. He didn't end up in the game because he's a bad drawing. So this little style guide sketch was when I felt like I'd kind of actually cracked a good look for the game. It doesn't have the heavy black shadows that would become a big part of the style yet, but I felt like this was the point at which I'd arrived at the right amount of detail and the right amount of line work that I'd want to put into a monster. It was kind of complex, but the shapes were easy to draw, and the inking style was much faster than the really smooth, clean TV style that I'd used in the earlier monsters. So after a lot of design back and forth, we ended up settling on the suite of monsters that we can see here. Pretty much made it into the game entirely. First one didn't. The Rocketeer is what eventually would become the Zek. These names are all of our development names for them, so they describe more what the creature did than anything flavorful. Ghost's pretty similar. In fact, it's almost identical, but this was pre-organization, so none of these were corporate. These were just citizens who turned into monsters. As time went on, we decided to bring in the idea of the corporation. So the Ghost was an Atori monster, so we tried to make him look a lot more like an espionage sort of character, which really just meant putting a hat on him, actually, and drawing more of the mechanical guts that were hidden in the shadows. The Swarm always worked this way, but this current Swarm was just kind of, I don't even know what this is. It's like robot heads or something. The Swarm that we ended up going with is meant to be these patients' heads, disembodied heads floating around that have somehow become motile. So that we kept the idea of the Swarm, but we didn't keep the art. The Sniper, as you can see, I had this idea of his head turning into a big brain, and it actually just didn't look great when it happened. So he got scrapped and turned into the upside down floater. Works exactly the same way, but doesn't have a complicated brain animation. Also, a brain is complicated and time consuming to draw hundreds of times. The Blaster is what we would call a janitor now, and he's pretty much the same as when he was designed. I say he, actually. It's meant to be a he or she and indistinguishable. The ogre we have here is a little smaller than the final ogre. We needed to make him look a lot more bulky and threatening than this ogre's actually kind of dainty looking. But he's got the same outfit and he does the same thing. Gremlin's pretty much unchanged, and the Bomb Slug, this was the old horror style Bomb Slug, which had kind of a guts and skulls and eyeballs in it. And I'm so much happier with the fedora wearing, no eyes, exploding tourist that we got. Tourist's actually probably my favorite monster in the game. So leaping all the way back to the beginning again, here are some robot designs that I did when we were thinking of having humanoid robots walking around on the ships, possibly oblivious to the player, and sometimes becoming hostile. This isn't something that really made it into the game at all, but we did have robots, and this robot design was one of the very few early designs that actually made it all the way through and is pretty much unchanged. So to finish up, it's a lot of fun to show you this early concept for a comic book cover, the fictional comic book cover for a comic that has never existed, where we were attempting to pull together all of the ideas that we'd come up with in the story, which was something that we hadn't even really written yet. We were trying to capture a feel. From my point of view, I was trying to do a very, it's almost a tribute to the old pulp novel and pulp science fiction comics, while trying to get across the idea that the player was in command of an endless parade of prisoners who every time they died would be replaced by another. I'm not sure how successful that really was in one illustration, but it at least showed that you'd be playing a lot of different types of person in this game, that it was unmistakably a comic book, and there was an evil computer of some kind, which, if you look at this thing, looks absolutely nothing like Bax, which is a character Kara invented once she started writing, which was after this drawing was done, I should add. And I think there's a screw there giving a guy a hug, turning him into a monster, which is something that obviously doesn't happen in the game anymore. But so that's going to wrap it up. That's all I've got time for today. Thanks for watching. I'm really disappointed that I didn't get to meet you all in person at GDC and have a chat and take some questions. Maybe next year there'll be less disasters and we can all hang out then. So looking forward to then. Thanks very much. I'm Ben Lee. This has been Void Bastards Origin Stories. Be excellent to each other.